For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to House Resolution 188, I call up H.R. 8, the Bipartisan Background Checks Act of 2021, and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk report the title of the bill.
H.R. 8, a bill to require a background check for every firearm sale.
Pursuant to House Resolution 188, the bill is considered read. The bill is debatable for 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking member of the Committee on the Judiciary. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, and the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, will each control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and insert extraneous material on H.R. 8.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 3 minutes.
Recognized for 3 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, gun violence impacts all of our communities, and no place is immune from its reach, including our homes, our streets, our schools, and even our places of worship. That is why we must take swift and decisive action to reduce the daily toll of gun violence that afflicts our nation. H.R. 8, the Bipartisan Background Checks Act of 2021, is sensible and effective legislation to do just that. Under current law, gun sales conducted by licensed firearms dealers may only be completed if the buyers clear background checks. This bill would simply extend that requirement, with limited exceptions, to guns transferred by unlicensed individuals as well. That simple change to close a gaping loophole in the law is one of the most effective steps we can take to address the scourge of gun violence in this country. According to one study, 22% of gun owners in the U.S. acquired their most recent firearm without a background check. We do not know if they were felons, fugitives, domestic abusers, or otherwise prohibited under the law from possessing firearms. A huge volume of guns was sold with no questions asked. It is time to close this dangerous loophole. There is no reason to continue to make it easy for people who are legally prohibited from possessing firearms to acquire them. And the evidence clearly shows that background checks work and significantly curb gun violence. One study found that a Connecticut law requiring background checks was associated with a 40% decline in gun homicides and a 15% drop in suicides. On the other hand, when Missouri repealed its background check law, the state's gun homicides increased by 23% and suicides increased by 16%. Gun violence of this magnitude is a distinctly American problem. A recent study in the American Journal of Medicine found that compared to 29 other high-income countries, the gun-related murder rate in the United States is 25 times higher. Even when you adjust for population differences, Americans are disproportionately killed by gun violence. This is a disparity that we can remedy by passing this bill. With the exception of certain limited transfers, such as gifts to family members and transfers for hunting, target shooting, and self-defense, H.R. 8 would extend the current federal background check requirement, which applies now only to licensed gun dealers, and would require virtually all transactions to undergo a background check to help ensure that firearms do not end up in the wrong hands. I thank Representative Mike Thompson of California for drafting this important legislation and for being a champion of gun violence prevention in Congress. Simply put, H.R. 8 will save lives. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation and to support safer streets, safer schools, and safer communities. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. From Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would yield 2.5 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Kentucky and the co-chair, of the Second Amendment Caucus, Mr. Massey.
Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, Democrats today want to introduce gun control legislation that they say is going to make you safer. They want to expand background checks. But what do background checks accomplish? Well, the DOJ said there were 112,000 denials in a year. Who were those 112,000 people? Well, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle would have you think those were felons. They saved you from those felons. But how many of those 112,000 were prosecuted for that crime of trying to acquire that gun? According to the DOJ, 12. 1, 2. 12 in a year. Who were the other 100,000? Imagine, just imagine now, that you're the victim of an abusive relationship, and after 5 years, you've summoned the courage and the resources to separate from that relationship. But things have escalated, and now you've decided it's time to acquire the means to protect you and your children. So you go to the gun store and you try to buy a gun. The clerk presses the computer button. It says denied. You ask the clerk, why was it denied? I don't know, this happens sometimes. Maybe you had a similar name to somebody else in the database. You can't buy a gun today, tomorrow, next week, not ever. You've been denied. So you go to a friend you've known for a long time. Your friend says, I'd like to help you. You say, well, I don't know if I'm going to make it through the night. The friend says, I'd like to help you, but don't you know H.R. 8 passed, and it was signed by the president. I can't spend a year in a cage. Good luck tonight. Now, I'm not going to ask you to imagine what happens next, because the Democrats saw fit to put into this bill a requirement that you have an imminent threat of death. The threat has to be right there upon you, or great bodily harm. What are they saying? Well, if you're just expecting a few bruises and maybe a punch, put some ice on it. I'm going to ask my colleagues here today, I'm going to challenge the sponsors of this bill, and those of you who might think you would vote for this bill, to consider whether it's fair. Is it fair to surround yourself with armed guards, with Capitol Hill police who have guns, with personal details, bodyguards, and ask the people to pay for it when you make it harder for those same people to protect themselves? I don't think that's fair. And for the fact checkers who are already hard at work on this speech, I ask unanimous consent to submit to the record this GAO report on the DOJ statistics on background checks.
Without objection.
I yield back.
Fired. The gentleman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished Majority Leader of the House, Mr. Hoyer.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Well, that's an interesting speech to follow. Mr. Massey was very energized. I haven't seen, of course, that which he submitted for the record, but 90% of America thinks this bill makes sense. 90%. Take your own polls. Poll after poll after poll shows overwhelming support of this legislation because it's common sense. It's common sense that you want to assure the community that those who buy weapons that can be used with deadly force, as the gentleman just indicated, are not a danger to themselves or to others. Mr. Speaker, according to the database from the Associated Press, USA Today, and Northeastern University that tracks mass shootings, which they define as 4 or more victims, not including the shooter, 2020 was a standout year. After years of setting new records for mass shootings, 2019 had the highest number recorded, 33 mass shootings in 1 year. But in 2020, there were only 2 mass shootings. One in February and another in early March. Of course, Mr. Speaker, those numbers don't count the hundreds of shootings each year in which there are fewer than 4 victims, with tens of thousands killed or maimed by gun violence annually. The contrast in the number of mass shootings from 2019 to 2020 is stark. Madam Speaker, I don't have to explain to my colleagues why mass shootings suddenly came to a halt last year, but it shouldn't take a deadly viral pandemic, which took us out of group meetings, which took us off the streets, which kept us at home, to stop a deadly epidemic of gun violence. And with the arrival of vaccines and passage of President Biden's plan to help make it safe to reopen businesses and schools, we will soon be gathering in groups once more. But nobody wants to see a return to mass shootings, Mr. Speaker. Nobody wants to see a return to deadly school shootings that terrorized America's students. We shouldn't need a pandemic to reduce gun violence in this country. The way to do that ought to be through passing common sense gun safety legislation through Congress to make it harder for deadly firearms to get into the hands of those who cannot bear them responsibly. That's what H.R. 8, the Bipartisan Background Checks Act, would do. 9 out of 10 Americans support the reforms in this bill. Now, I know I've seen some people, Mr. Speaker, shake their head. No, that's not the case. Show me a poll that has less than 80% of Americans thinking that terrorists should not be able to buy guns, that felons should not be able to buy guns, that domestic abusers should not buy guns, particularly in an accelerated way. You get mad at a partner, you get mad at a girlfriend, a boyfriend, or whatever, go down the store, boy, get a gun, bang. It's one thing to have a thoughtful purchase. I want to have a hunting gun, I want to have a handgun for target practice, I want a handgun for safety in my home, in my business, in my car. But if you're a person who has shown that you're not somebody who is a responsible person, sort of like driving a car. If you're not responsible, you're a reckless driver and you've been guilty of manslaughter by automobile or something of that nature, people have a right to know that what you do is going to be not a danger to them. This is one of the greatest examples of legislation that truly reflects the will of the American people. That's why I hope we can come together to pass it with bipartisan support. I don't know that's going to be the case. But if it's not the case, it will not reflect the will of the American people, which would like to see this on a bipartisan basis. Republicans and Democrats, polled, support this legislation. Now, if somebody wants to show me a poll that says, no, that's not the case, that's one thing. But I haven't seen a poll that doesn't reflect that. Just as I believe we ought to do this week with Representative Clyburn's bill as well, which could close the loophole that contributed to the reprehensible and racially motivated mass shooting at the Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina in 2015. 9 people in church slain by somebody who got a gun, who, if the report had come back in a timely fashion, wouldn't have been able to get that gun. I hope that Senate Republicans will not filibuster this bill. At some point in time, the majority ought to rule. Now, the Second Amendment correctly protects gun ownership. I don't have an argument with that. But the Supreme Court itself said that there can be responsible restraints and items for protection consistent with that amendment. That's what this bill does. I hope our friends will listen to the voices of parents, children, siblings, spouses, neighbors, and friends of those who were killed by gun violence in recent years. And I hope they'll remember the names and bring tears to many eyes and pain in so many hearts. Parkland. Now, some believe Parkland didn't happen. They're wrong, of course. Sandy Hook, Charleston, Las Vegas, Orlando, Pittsburgh, Annapolis, San Bernardino, Washington Navy Yard, just a few blocks from here, Oak Creek, Tucson, Virginia Tech, and the list could go on and on and on. Ladies and gentlemen of the House, let's not add more names to this register of grief. Let's not rely on a pandemic to do what we ought to have done so long ago. Let's pass these bills and reduce gun violence the right way with our votes. Is this a perfect bill? Will it establish or accomplish the absolute safety? It will not. But what 90% of Americans say is it's a step in the right direction. Mr. Speaker, let us take that step, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
No, it does, Mr. Speaker, no, it doesn't. The previous speaker said this bill becomes law, it'll stop some of the mass shootings, all the mass shootings that happen in this country. No, it won't. Nothing in this bill would have stopped any of those terrible things that took place. What this bill does is stop law-abiding citizens from exercising their Second Amendment liberties, just as the gentleman from Kentucky mentioned a few minutes ago. I would yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Indiana, Ms. Sparks.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to H.R. 8. A major reason our founding fathers drafted the Second Amendment is to have a check and balance for the people against the tyranny of government. It is the Second Amendment for a reason, not the 9th or 10th. You must have the second to protect the first. The first action by history dictators, and we know all of them, was to take guns from law-abiding citizens. We must remember that there is no law that stops criminals from getting guns or committing crimes. We would have empty prisons otherwise. As someone who grew up under a tyrannical government, I value these rights tremendously, and it helped these rights, a lot of Americans, to have equality and freedoms. And I encourage my colleagues to be vigilant and protect these rights for all law-abiding Americans. I urge my colleagues to oppose this bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Ohio reserves. Gentleman from New York recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 3 minutes to the distinguished sponsor of this bill, the distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. Thompson.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Every day 30 people are killed by someone using a gun. That number jumps to 100 if you factor in accidents and suicides involving guns. The steady stream of gun violence devastates families, communities, and schools. Gun violence costs our country $280 billion every year. This status quo is not okay. Our constituents know it, and they support H.R. 8 overwhelmingly. The special order last night on H.R. 8 was another low point for decorum in the House. To be generous, it was an embarrassing display and a complete misrepresentation of the facts. Viewers were told that the bill would create a federal gun registry. Wrong. Read page 5, line 18. H.R. 8 prohibits any registry. They were told that you can't give a gun to a family member. Wrong. Read page 3, line 7. You can. They were told that you can't transfer a gun if someone was suicidal or needed it for protection to address a self-defense situation. Wrong. Read page 3, line 21. You can. They were told that you can't lend a gun to a friend to go hunting. Wrong. Read page 4, line 16. You can. What the bill does do is close the private gun sale loophole, which has made it easy for felons and other prohibited purchasers to buy a gun online, at gun shows, or in person-to-person sales. We know universal background checks work. Every day they stop some 160 felons and some 50 domestic abusers from buying a gun. Every day. But without universal background checks, these people can take their business elsewhere, to someone without a federal firearms license, and buy the same gun. I've personally filled out the 4473 form required to buy a gun from a licensed dealer. I've done it many times. It's something that every responsible gun owner should be able to live with. Heck, they should welcome it because it helps stop dangerous individuals from getting a gun. In 90% of the cases, background checks are completed within minutes. Mr. Speaker, I ask that these letters that I have from dozens of gun violence prevention groups, healthcare workers, law enforcement, and others be made part of the record. On the bill, we have co-authors who are Democrats and Republicans, cops, hunters, gun owners, district attorneys, a former FBI agent, and veterans who have served in combat and put their lives on the line to protect our Second Amendment. There is bipartisan support for universal background checks in Congress and near universal support for background checks from the American people. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on H.R. 8, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Without objection, the materials will be entered into the record.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Georgia, or excuse me, a minute and a half to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr.
Gentleman
Heiss.
from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my good friend from Ohio. Look, bottom line is we all know that by definition, criminals don't abide by the law. And that applies also when they are purchasing firearms. Nothing in this bill prohibits this type of individual from obtaining firearms. In fact, the majority of individuals in prison for committing crimes with firearms obtain their firearms through theft, the underground market, family members, and the like. But what this bill does is threaten everyday American citizens with up to a year in prison and a $100,000 fine for exercising their Second Amendment right and doing common practices. This is, and to say that this does not create a national gun registry, you cannot accomplish what's in this bill without a gun registry. The reality is universal background checks do not stop mass shootings. We do not have mass shootings because of a lack of background checks. This bill will not make our communities safer. In fact, what it will do is cause law-abiding citizens to lose more of their Second Amendment rights. We shouldn't be focused here in Congress in taking those rights away. We actually should be strengthening the enforcement of laws we already have to make our communities safer. I stand with the Constitution and urge my colleagues to vote against H.R. 8, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Ohio reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the fact is that 160 felons every day buy guns. All this bill does is to say that people who buy guns, who obtain guns from unlicensed dealers as well as licensed dealers must be subject to the background check, and that will save a heck of a lot of lives. I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Gentleman from Houston is recognized.
I thank the gentleman very much. You know, our friends on the other side of the aisle are deadly wrong. That's the tragedy of their argument, because the Second Amendment does not prohibit regulation. It never did. And our founding fathers regulated guns as early as the beginning of this nation. And so I rise in support of H.R. 8 and indicate why the COVID-19 pandemic dominated news headlines in 2020, the number of shootings surged in many communities across America. Our public health and emergency resources have been straining to respond from the coronavirus, but budgets are crunched nationwide, and as well, gun violence is rising. It's important to note because approximately 80% of firearms used for criminal purposes are obtained without a background check. We must strengthen our firearms because background checks and close dangerous gaps such as the online sale and gun show loopholes. In the data that we were able to secure, there was nearly one mass shooting per day in the United States, 355 mass shootings in 2018. We realize that since December 2012, there have been at least 1,518 mass shootings with at least 1,715 people killed. Each day, an average 92 Americans are victims of gun violence, resulting in more than 33,000 deaths. And I wonder why our friends could not feel the pain of the loss of guns being transferred illegally or improperly. I was here for Columbine. That happened on April 20th, 1999. High school students losing their lives. I was here when babies were killed in Newtown, Connecticut, December 12th, 2012. I was here in the United States Congress each moment we tried to pass sensible gun legislation like H.R. 8. Thanking you, Chairman Thompson, for your leadership, and Chairman Nadler. On February 14, 2018, I was here for Parkland and look at these. And as well, I was here on May 18th in Santa Fe, Texas, when people died. It is time to pass H.R. 8. Stop seeing our children
Gentlewoman's
die.
time has expired. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Owens.
Gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in opposition to H.R. 8 and H.R. 1446. In this last week, I received over 1,000 emails from constituents in strong opposition to these anti-gun bills. Here's a sample. H.R. 8 will make it impossible to sell or loan guns to my relatives and trusted friends. These bills appear designed to impose restrictions on natural rights guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution. And finally, stand up for our rights and oppose these measures with every tool in your grasp. I absolutely will fight these measures with every tool in my grasp. These rights to protect my life, liberty, and property were granted to me by God and cannot be taken away from me by D.C. bureaucrats. I grew up in the Deep South at a time when Black Americans were unable to defend themselves. After the Civil War, black codes and Jim Crow laws prohibited people of color from owning firearms. In the mid-1950s, Martin Luther King Jr. kept firearms for self-protection, but his application for concealed weapon permit was denied because of racist gun control laws in his state. As a child, my dad witnessed an altercation between his father and a Southern white man who thought my grandfather was being disrespectful and threatened to teach him a lesson. Later that night, he drove up to my grandfather's home with a bunch of his friends, standing on the forerunner of a Model T Ford. My grandfather was prepared. He and his brothers had hidden around his front porch, and as these bullies and cowards approached the house, they heard the click of rifles and left as fast as they came. Without firing his gun on another human being, my grandfather's right to own a firearm ensured his rights to protect his life, liberty, and property. I urge my colleagues to vote against these anti-Second Amendment bills. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Ohio reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. Swalwell.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
I thank Mr. Thompson for this legislation because it takes the most dangerous weapons out of the hands of the most dangerous people. I've heard from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle about rights. Let's talk about some other rights in this country, like the right to pray in church, the right to dance at a party, the right to come home from a concert, the right to come back home safely and alive. Those are rights that matter too. And I am for this because I think about a mother who told me a couple years ago to keep fighting on this issue because every day when she puts her children in the car and sends them off to school, before they get out of the car, she closes her eyes to remember what they were wearing because she was afraid that one day she may have to identify them. This bill says we don't have to live that way anymore. The right to come home alive is greater than any right that is being put forward by the other side. And I yield back.
Yields back. The gentleman from Ohio.
Mr. Speaker, I yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gomer.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've been told that 90% of Americans support this bill. Well, that's because 99.99% of Americans have not read this bill. And we're told yet again that this will save lives. And yet, there is not one single mass killing that's been brought up here today that would have been prevented by this bill. And yet, over and over, we have people come in here. Usually they mean well. Look, this will protect people, when the fact is that they can't point to any of these mass killings they talk about that would have been prevented. So let's talk about lives that would be saved. Think about the people that are shot every day, and would their situation be different if they were not having it so difficult to legally get a gun? I mean, I think we had thousands of cases, felony cases that came through my court, and we tried a lot of those cases. Over and over, you hear the criminals, they're not obeying the law. They're not going to follow the law. They got their guns illegally. And this will not change at all any of those people we tried and convicted for getting guns. They steal them. They buy them from other people that stole them. They don't obey the law. That's why they're criminals. So quit penalizing the American people. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Maryland.
Mr. Speaker,
The gentleman from New York. I'm sorry, Mr. Raskin.
I yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin.
The gentleman from Maryland is now recognized.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. Americans are 25 times more likely to die from gun violence than people who live in other developed countries. And on that point, our perpetually outraged and indignant colleagues have absolutely nothing to say. We lose 38,000 people a year, more than 100 people a day. From Newtown, Connecticut to El Paso, Texas, gun violence is ripping the heart out of our social contract, making life for Americans nasty, poor, solitary, brutish, and short, a Hobbesian state of war. H.R. 8 will close 3 gaping loopholes in the law: the gun show loophole, the internet loophole, and the private sale loophole, cutting down precisely on the traffic in illegal guns, which our colleagues cite as the source of criminal gun violence. In opposing the American Rescue Plan, they voted against science. In opposing H.R. 1, they voted against democracy. And now in opposing H.R. 8, they're voting against public safety and the social contract itself. What a moral collapse for a once great party.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs.
Gentleman is recognized.
I thank the gentleman, and I thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, last 2 weeks the majority has attacked the First Amendment, and now they're attacking the Second Amendment. H.R. 8 will not save lives. As Justice Scalia noted in his decision in Heller, the Second Amendment does not give Americans a right. It protects a pre-existing right, and that right shall not be infringed. H.R. 8 would not have prevented recent shootings. In Parkland, the shooter acquired the firearm legally from an FFL after undergoing a NICS check. The same thing in Sutherland Springs, Texas. The same in Las Vegas, Nevada. And the same in Orlando. And I could go on because the list would produce the same result. They got their guns after a background check, including in El Paso. Criminals who seek to do harm get guns, regardless of the new restrictions imposed by H.R. 8. And with very limited exceptions, H.R. 8 makes it illegal for Americans to get a gun if a non-licensed importer, manufacturer, or dealer is not involved. And how will government know if an illegal transfer occurs? Without a registry, this bill is unenforceable. I've heard supporters of this bill say that other countries have similar restrictions, so we should too. And I counter with the fact that other countries do not have the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment was included to ensure that the United States would be different than other countries. I oppose this bill, and I urge my colleagues to do the same, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Jayapal.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of H.R. 8, the Bipartisan Background Checks Act. This bill is among the most common sense gun violence prevention reforms, requiring background checks for unlicensed sellers. This is not complicated, Mr. Speaker. This is simple. Under H.R. 8, people who wish to transfer a firearm would have to visit a licensed firearm dealer to run a background check before the transfer could be finalized. Most of these checks take 90 seconds. 90 seconds to prevent firearms from ending up in the wrong hands. 90 seconds to prevent more of our loved ones from being killed by gun violence. I'm proud to be from Washington State, where voters have consistently tackled gun violence with common sense reforms, passing one of the first, most comprehensive background check laws in 2014 and raising the legal age to purchase a semi-automatic rifle to 21 in 2018. Let's do this, Mr. Speaker, to save lives. Vote aye.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, H.R. 8 is brought to us by the same organizations and politicians who've made no secret of their intention ultimately to strip law-abiding citizens of their right to defend themselves. Now, they know they can't do it outright, so they do it through cynical measures like this, which weave a web of laws so intricate that sooner or later everyone can be caught up in them. This law affects not only sales, but any transfer of a weapon for any period of time. Now, a couple of years ago, a 10-year study by Johns Hopkins and UC Davis concluded that California's background check law had no effect on gun homicides or suicides. None. The purpose of this bill is not public safety. That's its deceptive facade. Its purpose is to make gun ownership so legally hazardous, so fraught with legal booby traps and draconian penalties that no honest and law-abiding citizen would ever want to take the risk. Most criminals already get their guns illegally. They're unconstrained by laws like this. This bill is aimed squarely at law-abiding citizens, moving us closer to a society where decent people are defenseless and armed criminals are kings. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. McBath.
Gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. McBath, is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 2 years ago, I came to Congress, and one of my first actions as a member was co-sponsoring this bipartisan legislation that will save lives. I know the pain of gun violence firsthand. 8 years ago, I lost my son, Jordan, a victim of a gun in the wrong hands. With this legislation, we empower law enforcement to keep guns from those who might do harm by simply requiring a background check whenever a gun is sold. This is common sense legislation that will prevent more families from knowing the pain of losing a loved one to gun violence. But just like 2 years ago, our vote today is beginning, and it's definitely not the end. And again, passing this bipartisan common sense legislation, we call on our colleagues in the Senate to do what is right to keep America's families safe. And I am proud once again to stand in support of this legislation as a survivor of gun violence myself. Congress's refusing to pass this vital legislation would be America's shame and burden for generations to come. And now yield back the balance of my time.
The lady yields back the balance of her time. The gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would yield a minute and a half to the gentlelady from Colorado, the co-chair of the Second Amendment Caucus, Ms. Fobert.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Ranking Member Jim Jordan. I was raised, Mr. Speaker, in a Democrat home, so I understand how these policies are deceiving. I understand that we're told guns are scary. That's what we were told, and that's what we believed, because we trusted the people that we voted for. But just as most things in life, I grew up and learned that there's a better way to live. I was ignorant to firearms and the proper use of them. When I became a business owner, I needed to protect myself. There was an altercation outside of my restaurant where a man was physically beat to death. There were no weapons involved. He was beat to death by another man's hands. I have a lot of young girls who work in my restaurant, and we needed an equalizer. I'm 5 foot tall. I barely weigh 100 pounds. I need something against a stronger potential aggressor to defend myself with. Talk about women's rights. Don't take my right away to protect myself. I mean, seriously, what are we doing here? I ask the supporters of this legislation, who do you think you are to disarm Americans and leave them vulnerable without help? You want to defund our police and yet leave us without a way to protect ourselves. Our founding fathers gave us a list of items and said, don't touch these things. And I'm telling you,
Gentlelady's time has expired.
keep your hands off.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
Second
Members
Amendment.
are reminded to address their comments to the chair. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am assuming our colleague on the other side of the aisle can pass a background check so she will have no inability to have a gun. I rise in support of H.R. 8, the Background Check Act, because even as we manage a deadly pandemic, gun violence continues to plague our nation. Every year, more than 130,000 people in this nation are victims of gun violence, some 38,000 dead, another 100,000 caught in the crossfire. In my home region of Philadelphia, 2,244 people were victims of gun violence in year 2020. Death by guns doesn't mean only murders. Sadly, it also means death by suicide, using a firearm, which was the cause and the case in 62% of Pennsylvania's gun deaths last year. This is a public health crisis. The Background Check Act requires a background check for all gun sales, no loopholes, no backdoors, a common-sense solution supported by a majority of Americans, including 89% of Republicans and 87% of gun owners. Let's find the courage to address the crisis. Let's save lives.
Gentlelady's
Let's pass
time has
the bill.
expired. The gentleman from Ohio.
Mr. Speaker, maybe the previous speaker talked about the increase in violent crime in her neighborhood last year. Maybe if Democrats actually supported our police and not supporting defund the police, maybe that wouldn't be the case. I yield a minute and a half to the gentlelady from Arizona, Ms. Lesko.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Jordan. Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to this bill. H.R. 8 is an assault on our Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. The bill turns law-abiding citizens into criminals by subjecting them to criminal penalties for simply lending a friend or a neighbor a gun on a temporary basis. Additionally, the bill will inevitably lead to a national gun registry because without a registry, the government has no way to implement this legislation. This bill is certainly a slippery slope. Most alarmingly, this bill does nothing, absolutely nothing, to stop criminals from obtaining firearms. According to the Department of Justice, less than 1% of criminals in prison who possessed a firearm during their offense obtained the firearm from a licensed dealer, meaning criminals would still have access to firearms under this law. This bill is just the first of many steps to take away our Second Amendment rights. I urge my colleagues to vote against this bill, and with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Lady yields back. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Neguse.
Gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Neguse, is recognized.
I thank the chair. Mr. Speaker, I rise today for the more than 100,000 Americans who every year are impacted by gun violence. And I rise today to give voice to the overwhelming majority of the American people who support universal background checks. Communities in Colorado have experienced the tragedy and the grief of gun violence far too many times. Columbine, Aurora, Highlands Ranch. Enough is enough, Mr. Speaker. We have lost too many parents and friends, neighbors, students, and children to gun violence. This Congress must act, which is why I support H.R. 8. We must act on gun violence, we must pass H.R. 8, and we must send it to President Biden's desk. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio is again recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Klein.
Gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Enough is enough, which is why I rise in strong opposition to H.R. 8 and to offer a motion to recommit the bill. This bill is nothing more than a coordinated effort by the authoritarian left to strip away the constitutional rights guaranteed to Americans by the Second Amendment. Instead of criminalizing the innocent actions of law-abiding gun owners, American citizens, we should be focused on stopping real crime in our local communities and enforcing the laws that are already on the books. One way we can do that is by ensuring that ICE is notified when unlawful aliens attempt to purchase a firearm illegally. The FBI reported just last month that NICS had over 10 million people listed as an illegal alien. In fact, this ranks as the #1 prohibited category in the FBI's NICS indices. Since 1998, over 28,000 illegal aliens have been denied a firearm after failing a NICS check. With over 2,700 in 2019 alone, this means over 28,000 criminals have been allowed to stay in the United States when ICE should have been alerted about their criminal acts, but were not. H.R. 8 fails to do anything to prevent crime, which is why I'm offering this motion to recommit so our nation's laws are enforced. And if you will recall, this MTR passed in 2019 with a strong bipartisan majority. Mr. Speaker, if we adopt the motion to recommit, we will instruct the Judiciary Committee to consider my amendment to H.R. 8 to ensure that the FBI alerts ICE anytime an illegal alien is denied a firearm because of NICS. I ask unanimous consent to insert the text of the amendment in the record immediately prior to the vote on the motion to recommit, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Without objection, The gentleman from New York is now recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Massachusetts, Ms. Clark.
Gentlelady is recognized.
In 2016, after the tragic Pulse nightclub shooting, I, with my colleagues, sat in protest on this very floor with our friend, the late Congressman John Lewis. And on that day, Congressman Lewis told us, "We have turned deaf ears to the blood of the innocent and the concern of our nation. We are blind to this crisis." 7 years later, we have endured thousands of mass shootings. We have mourned the loss of 100 people every single day to suicide and homicide with guns. Today's vote will improve the safety of our schools, our communities, and our streets. It's a vote for kids and parents and veterans and our neighbors. I stand here today thinking of the many survivors and families who have been waiting for this moment. And I think of my friend John, who told us to always speak out for the voiceless and act boldly for justice. Today, with this bill, we will do just that.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Clyde.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to stand against H.R. 8. This bill would make it a crime to transfer a firearm from one individual to another without a federal firearms licensee overseeing the transfer and conducting a background check on the prospective buyer. While there are limited exceptions to this bill, it does nothing to address how violent criminals actually obtain firearms, nor does the bill make it harder for them to obtain a firearm. That's because criminals don't follow the law. That's why they're called criminals. So by making these types of changes to the law, the bill does nothing to prohibit guns from ending up in the hands of criminals. And instead, it does everything possible to make it harder for law-abiding citizens to exercise their Second Amendment rights. I urge a no vote on H.R. 8. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Massachusetts, Ms. Trahan.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is a rampaging public health emergency that's been going on for far too long. And there have been countless chilling examples of what happens when we fail to act or only take half measures. Anodyne placebos. Each time, more lives lost. Moreover, we've seen a particular community unjustly suffer scorn for this emergency. They've been scapegoated rather than recognized as the fellow victims of this crisis. But there is no question that the harms of this crisis haven't fallen evenly, and the disparate harm offers all the more reason for actual solutions, not mere talk. By now, my colleagues know that I'm not talking about COVID. I'm referring to gun violence. Today, the most common sense, broadly popular, and impactful thing that we can do is pass H.R. 8 and bolster our pitifully weak background check system in the United States. Keeping deadly weapons out of the hands of those fueled by hate is as common sense as it gets. And I urge my colleagues to vote for H.R. 8. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy.
Gentleman is recognized.
I thank the gentleman from Ohio. Right now, in South Texas, there are American citizens whose lives are in danger because of wide open borders as a direct result of Biden's border crisis and the policies of the Democratic leadership of this body and the Senate. American citizens are unsafe. I'm not making that up. For the last 2 years, I've heard my Democrat colleagues talking about a fake crisis at our border. There is nothing fake about 100,000 people coming across our border, or high-speed chases through Uvalde, Texas, or high-speed chases in Real County, which I represent. There is nothing fake about that. Break-ins, lives in danger, people who own ranches. And now my Democratic colleagues, after defunding the police, opening up our borders, want to take away our God-given right, yes, God-given right to defend ourselves under the Second Amendment. That's what this is about. This is about creating a gun registry to track guns of the American people. There is no way to implement what the Democrats are trying to implement without doing that. And I can just tell you straight up, Texans, Americans, the government is never going to know what weapons I own. Let me be clear about that. It's not going to happen. We have a God-given right to defend our families, defend our state, and defend ourselves against tyranny, and we will do that regardless of the inerrant policies that this Democratic Congress is trying to jam through. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman now from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Kelly.
Gentlelady from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you. Soon we will take a bipartisan vote on the Background Checks Act, a bill which could save lives in every district of our nation. Expanding background checks will help prevent guns from getting to the hands of those who may be a danger to themselves or others. This is a simple, common-sense solution to a worsening problem in our nation. Even in 2020, when many people were at home during the raging COVID-19 pandemic, we lost more than 41,000 people to gun violence. That number includes nearly 300 children under the age of 11. My heart breaks for their parents. But heartbreak will do little to comfort those mourning families, and we know well enough by now it will do nothing to prevent any future tragedies. It's time for us to step up to say enough is enough. It's time for our families to be able to play in the park, drive a car in the expressway, or on a bus, or other things we take for granted without fear of gun violence. We need to pass legislation that will save precious lives. I ask, how many funerals have you attended? I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of H.R. 8, expand background checks, and make our nation safer.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from North Carolina, Dr. Murphy.
Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank the gentleman from Ohio. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in opposition to H.R. 8 as well as H.R. 1446. There's not a single member in this chamber who does not mourn the innocent lives lost to gun violence. But I solemnly believe that my Democratic colleagues lack a fundamental understanding of this issue. I've worked as a surgeon that's done pelvic trauma for close to 30 years. In fact, I'll submit that I'm the only member of this chamber that's ever operated on a gunshot victim. The infinite majority of gunshot victims are shot by criminals who have obtained their guns illegally. They did not apply for permits. They're not a member of the NRA. They are criminals. These bills would do nothing to keep the guns out of their hands. In all my years as a surgeon, I have yet to see a gun jump up by itself and injure someone. It is either from a crime, a mental illness, or tragically from an accident. Where I live in eastern North Carolina is certainly different from New York City, the gun haven of Chicago, or Oakland, but we still have our share of drug-related and gang-related crime. On the other hand, we have a lot of wilderness that people back home where adults and children still enjoy hunting. These law-abiding citizens should not have their rights trampled upon. We are all saddened by the loss of life from mass shootings. But folks here, the issue is not the gun itself, but the mental illness borne by the gun holder. A mentally stable person does not shoot innocent people. H.R. 8 and H.R. 1446 absurdly, we have 30 seconds?
The gentleman, additional 30 seconds.
Gentleman may proceed.
Absurdly hamper people's ability to exercise their constitutional right to defend themselves. This sort of broad government overreach does not save lives, but treats everyday law-abiding citizens like criminals. I urge my colleagues to vote no on these bills. We should not support bills that place the rights of violent criminals above those law-abiding American citizens. Thank you, and I yield.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, how much time remains?
The gentleman from New York is advised that you have 11 and a half minutes. The gentleman from Ohio is advised that you have 10 and a half minutes.
10 minutes.
Excuse me, correction, 10 minutes even.
Thank you. I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. Levin.
I rise today as a proud co-sponsor of H.R. 8, the Bipartisan Background Checks Act. This legislation has one simple goal: keep guns out of the hands of people who are dangerous. More than 90% of the American people support universal background checks on every firearm sale or transfer, and that's what this bill does. Our constituents expect us to find common ground to finally end the gun violence epidemic in this country. They expect us to pass this bipartisan bill. The era of offering only thoughts and prayers is over. It is over. The American people demand action. H.R. 8 is the action they are calling for. To my colleagues, I urge you to stand with the American people and vote yes. Let's get this done. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Budd.
Mr. Budd from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my friend from Ohio. You know, the fundamental truth is that the Second Amendment guarantees the right of law-abiding citizens to keep and bear arms to protect themselves and their loved ones. America's founders spoke on this issue extensively. Benjamin Franklin warned that those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. Benjamin Franklin was right. The American tradition of self-reliance, self-determination, and self-defense has been fierce. It's been what makes this country so exceptional and so great. Today, the House will vote on legislation that would undermine that very right. What's worse is that both of these bills would not have prevented mass shootings or tragedies across this nation. And those are awful events. We all agree that those events are awful. But in those cases, the criminal either passed a background check or they stole their weapons. We cannot sacrifice our rights by passing laws that will make our families less safe and laws that criminals will simply ignore. We must always protect and preserve our God-given Second Amendment right. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my friend. I will remind my friend on the other side of the aisle, the God-given right every one of us has, according to the Declaration of Independence, is life. And that's what we're arguing about here today. Are we going to take protective measures that save lives? This bill does that. We got I talk about the ABCs of gun control. A, reinstate the assault weapons ban. B, universal background checks. And C, closing the gun show loophole. Those three practical measures will save lives. And because I support ABC, I get an F every year from the NRA, and I am proud of that grade every year. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio.
Mr. Speaker, point of order. I would request that the colleague from Virginia direct his remarks to you and not to other colleagues.
Stated his point of order. Gentleman is correct. The gentleman, all members are reminded to address their comments to the chair. The gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Shabbat.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's no secret that I've been a committed defender of the Second Amendment since being elected to Congress back in 1994. For me, that means that I'll do everything that I possibly can to ensure that the rights of Americans as it relates to the Second Amendment are protected, while at the same time working to keep firearms out of the hands of criminals and mentally unstable individuals. H.R. 8, unfortunately, doesn't accomplish either of those goals. It's overburdensome, unreasonable, and if passed, would instead keep firearms out of the hands of some hardworking and law-abiding citizens. Yesterday at Rules, I offered an amendment which would allow for the transfer of a firearm to museums or historical displays without going through the burdensome requirements of this measure. But that eminently reasonable amendment and others offered by my colleagues were flatly rejected by the majority. During this afternoon's debate, we've again expressed several concerns which will not be addressed or considered by the majority, instead of focusing on improving the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, or NICS, providing resources to assist those with mental illnesses, or hardening soft targets like schools and places of worship. The majority will pass this legislation and attempt to further infringe on the Second Amendment rights of our constituents. And that's very, very unfortunate. For those reasons, I stand in opposition to this deeply flawed legislation, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Wasserman Schultz.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise as both a mom and a member of Congress in strong support of H.R. 8. Last month, my community marked the 3-year anniversary of the Marjory Stoneman Douglas shootings that stole 17 innocent lives. The anxiety and terror that came that day has never left us, yet too many communities witness horrific gun violence every day. Common sense reforms can end this agony and keep us safer, namely by requiring background checks for gun sales. Yet loopholes allow up to 80% of firearms to be sold without background checks. We must mandate universal background checks for firearm sales by passing H.R. 8 and then pass Jamie's Law, my legislation that expands that same mandate to ammunition purchases. The pandemic made gun proliferation worse, and inaction is not an option. We must do all we can to ensure guns and bullets don't end up in the wrong hands. Mr. Speaker, the outliers on this issue are Republicans whose fealty to the NRA results in more people dying from gun violence. Enough is enough. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
The lady yields back. The gentleman from Ohio.
We reserve, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman reserved. Gentleman from New York. The gentleman from Ohio has reserved. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker,
Yes.
I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Florida, Mr. Deutsch.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this morning I walked by an elementary school. I saw parents dropping off their kids. And I thought of parents around the country sending their kids back to school after months of virtual learning. They want their children to be safe. But 8 years after Sandy Hook and 3 years after the shooting at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in my district, we should be ashamed that we have waited so long and wasted so much time when we could be saving lives. We cannot have safe communities until we fix the crumbling foundation of our gun laws. That is the background check system. Universal background checks will help keep guns out of dangerous hands. They will save lives in our schools. They will save lives in our homes. They will save lives on our streets. I urge my colleagues to stand with survivors and with gun owners and with Americans of both Democratic and Republican parties who support universal background checks by voting to pass H.R. 8.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio.
Mr. Speaker, we reserve.
The gentleman continues to reserve. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Texas, Mr. Dawkins.
The gentleman is recognized.
This bill simply requires that the background check for a purchase that occurs within a gun shop applies outside a gun shop. That doesn't take away anyone's right, but it does protect us from convicted criminals, fugitives, and family abusers who are prevented from evading the law to buy a weapon of war online or at a gun shop, at a gun show. Texas Gun Sense knows the gap in safety makes no sense. Unfortunately, NRA has come to stand for no Republican action. They offer us only moments of silence for mass murder, but they always come up short with one very important type of ammunition: courage. Students in March for Our Lives have that courage. Moms Demand Action are steadfast in demanding meaningful action. As these gun lobbies continue to oppose reasonable action, we must speak up for gun safety. We must listen to the victims of violence before their number is increased by another El Paso shooting, another school shooting, or another concert interrupted by gunfire.
The gentleman's
Act
time
now
has
to
expired.
save lives.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Massey.
I thank the gentleman from Ohio. I have a brief point to make. I wonder how my colleagues on the other side of the aisle hold two thoughts in contradiction simultaneously in their minds. They say that photo IDs, excessive registration paperwork, and whatnot disenfranchises disproportionately minorities and the poor when they go to exercise their right to vote. But today, with H.R. 8 and the next bill that's coming up, they are doing exactly that. They're causing there to be fees, increased paperwork, more photo IDs. How does that not disenfranchise not just all Americans, but disproportionately minorities and the poor? And I leave that to my colleagues to answer today. And I yield back to the gentleman.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from New York, Mr. Bowman.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I had the privilege of working in public education for 20 years. I started my career in 1999. This was the same year of the Columbine High School shooting. And throughout my career, unfortunately, we have to continually deal with school shootings, and we have to prepare in our schools, prepare children as young as 4 years old for the possibility of a school shooting. We have Columbine, we have Parkland, we have Virginia Tech, and we have Sandy Hook. I thought 9 years ago, when Sandy Hook occurred, that the country would stop, pause, and reflect on what's happening in our nation. A mass shooting of our 6-year-old children, our babies. This law will begin the process of protecting our most vulnerable and protecting our babies. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio.
Reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer.
Gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
It is an honor for me to be here today with my colleagues, Mr. Thompson. Lucy, your courage is inspirational to me. This has been a priority for me in the quarter century I've been in Congress. I've supported every single reform that's advanced. But we have a change today because we have never had, in 10 years, the alignment with a House leadership, a Senate leadership that will not bury it, and a president who will enthusiastically sign it into law. This is a landmark legislation that many of us have been working on literally for decades. And this is one more example of what difference it makes to have Democrats in charge and being able to advance meaningful gun safety. I thank my colleagues. I'm proud to stand with them, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio.
Mr. Speaker, we reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, how much time remains?
The gentleman is advised that you have 4.5 minutes. The gentleman from Ohio has 6.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from New York, Mr. Jeffries.
Gentleman is recognized. Mr. Jeffries.
Thank the distinguished chair for yielding. The right to bear arms is an important part of the constitutional fabric of this country, but it's not without limits. And the notion that America has 4% of the world's population, but 40% of the world's guns, and a disproportionately high amount of homicides and suicides by death should shock the conscience of every single person in this chamber. Mass shooting after mass shooting after mass shooting, and yet we haven't acted to protect the health, safety, and well-being of the American people. That is why H.R. 8 is so significant. Universal criminal background check legislation is reasonable under the circumstances, given the tragedies that we confront. House Democrats will not just talk about it, we are about it. That is why we'll pass H.R. 8, and now we have a Senate and a president who will ultimately get it over the finish line. Vote yes on this life-saving legislation.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield a minute and a half to the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Van Dyke.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Jordan. Madam Chair, I rise in opposition to the legislation we're considering today. In cities across America, violent crime has increased. And in cities across America, laws already exist to severely punish violent criminals. But despite this, we're seeing local elected officials, district attorneys, and prosecutors refuse to enforce existing laws, and police who are continuously held back from doing their jobs. Instead of offering real solutions to improve public safety, It seems the majority is determined to punish law-abiding citizens while doing nothing to actually close loopholes in the system. If the bills we are considering were really focused on stopping gun crimes and violent offenders from owning guns, then my amendment would be one we're discussing today, to prevent minors aged 15 to 17 who have committed violent crimes from having their records expunged and thereby able to purchase a firearm. But rather than take up my amendment to prevent felons from sidestepping our laws, the majority felt it much more critical for public safety to expand background checks to ranchers and farmers with pest control issues. This is absurd. Nothing in H.R. 1446 or H.R. 8 would prevent those seeking to harm others from acquiring firearms. The people of my district deserve better than this, which is why I'll be introducing legislation that will actually prevent violent criminals from cleaning their record. I urge my colleagues to oppose this bill and side with law-abiding Americans and side with those of us who want to focus on taking guns out of the hands of known violent criminals. And I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Garcia.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Chairman Nadler and my colleagues for their leadership on this issue. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of H.R. 8 and H.R. 1446, two gun violence protection bills that would help keep our communities safe. Look, I'm from Chicago, and we're no strangers to violence. In 2020 alone, the city recorded 3,261 shootings and 769 murders. Some of my colleagues might point out that Illinois has some of the strictest gun laws in the country. That's true. But studies tracking gun shows that often guns come from neighboring states with weaker gun laws. People drive one or two states over and come back with deadly weapons. The reality is that state laws aren't enough. We need stronger federal laws too. I urge my colleagues to pass these critical laws that have bipartisan support among voters across the country that would help keep guns off the streets, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The previous speaker talked about Chicago's strictest gun laws in the country, but yet a record number of shootings and crime last year. What could be the cause of that? Maybe it's the fact they defunded their police, something we've talked about now since the Democrats started doing it. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Wisconsin.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. One more time, we see people uncomfortable with our Constitution. Our forefathers gave us the right to bear arms because they want the law-abiding people to have the right to defend themselves. Until Ferguson and the rise of the anti-police movement, about 5 years ago, the murder rate of this country fell by over a half between the early 90s and around 2014. What happened at that time? We whipped up some anti-police hysteria, and since this time, things have gone mildly up. Now the majority party introduces a cachet of bills designed to make it more difficult for law-abiding people to access a weapon, while not having any impact on people who won't obey the laws anyway. They don't like the idea of private transfers. They don't like the idea of being able to get a gun in less than 10 days. They don't like the idea that if the government doesn't give the proper information over, apparently you like the idea that you want to keep people from getting guns if the government, for whatever reason, is slow as turning things over. In any event, let's go back to the things that worked for 25 years before the rise of the anti-police movement if we really want to see murders.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from New York.
We're prepared to close.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Ohio.
Is that okay? Yeah, good job. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Musers.
Thank you. I thank my good friend from Ohio. Mr. Speaker, once again, Democrat leadership is proposing legislation that would do nothing to prevent criminals from accessing firearms, while greatly restricting, Mr. Speaker, the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding citizens. These bills are being sold to the public as an effort to pass universal background checks, but House Democrats fail to recognize that every commercial gun sale in the United States already has a background check. Mr. Speaker, ending gun violence in America is a goal we all share. But H.R. 8 would subject law-abiding gun owners to criminal penalties for simply handing a firearm to another person. For instance, if you loaned a friend a rifle to go hunting, or if they could face a year in prison or a $100,000 fine. This is simply ridiculous. The same would be true if you loan an abuse victim a firearm for self-defense. H.R. 1446 would create arbitrary delays for firearm purchases and could allow the FBI to delay a firearm transfer indefinitely. These bills would do nothing to keep Americans safer and, in fact, threaten the public safety and our constitutional right to bear arms. I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back.
Is Byron here?
Does the gentleman from New York reserve? Gentleman reserves.
I think
Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yield the balance of our time. Excuse me. Mr. Speaker, yield a minute to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gooden.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In what alternative reality does it make sense for this Congress to take away people's rights to defend themselves and at the same time defund the police? That makes no sense. What we've seen in the last few days and in the last week in this Congress is an effort to punish the law-abiders in this nation. We got to stop doing this. If we take away the guns from law-abiding citizens, we're doing nothing to reduce crime. Look at Chicago. The law-abiding citizens there do not live in a safe environment. They're able to follow these procedures that you're passing, but it's not going to do anything to stop the violence. We've got to get away from this. We've got to stop these laws that do not represent the will of the American people. Let's stop punishing the law-abiding citizens of the United States and get back to what they sent us here to do. I yield back.
Gentleman from New York reserves, Mr. Jordan.
Mr. Speaker, can I inquire how much time we have left?
Sure. The gentleman from Ohio has 1.5 minutes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr.
Gentleman
Speaker.
from New York has 2.5 minutes.
Speaker, and then I'll close.
Yes.
We have just one speaker left.
So which way do I go?
Where's Nancy?
All right.
Yeah,
The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, what is your pleasure?
Yeah, we're going to. Well, Mr. Donald is going to be closing for us, Mr. Speaker, so we'll do that whenever you tell us to.
From Ohio, then reserves. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler.
We're prepared to close.
All right. From New York reserves. So now it's back to the minority.
Thank
Mr.
you.
Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield the remainder of our time to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Dons.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, gun crime in the United States is a tragedy for us all. I heard the talk about Sandy Hook, about Columbine, and yes, about Parkland, which happened in my state. It is a tragedy that we all face. But the one thing, Mr. Speaker, we all have to remember is that in each one of these instances, the person that acquired the firearm that committed this tragedy acquired it lawfully, or they stole the weapons from somebody else. This bill would not change any of those tragedies. If anything, what this bill does, it puts more burden on law-abiding Americans and does whittle away and strip their constitutional rights to bear arms. You see, the issue is much more about mental health than it is about the ability to acquire firearms. And for this body to unilaterally make it significantly more difficult for a law-abiding citizen to acquire a firearm, which is their constitutional God-given right, is this body acting outside of its authority under the United States Constitution. Mr. Speaker, in short, this bill will not fix the tragedies that we face. Unfortunately, laws don't fix most of the tragedies that we face as Americans. What fixes them is dealing with the human condition that unfortunately inhabits people in our country. We should be working on that, not stripping the constitutional rights from our fellow citizens. With that, I yield back to you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman yields back. And the gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Speaker, I
Yes.
yield myself the balance of our time.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, Since the House passed H.R. 8 more than 2 years ago, an estimated 80,000 people have lost their lives to gun violence. We have had too many moments of silence and too many expressions of sympathy. Too many families are grieving the loss of a loved one. Expanding background checks is overwhelmingly supported by the American public because they know that it will make a meaningful difference in reducing gun violence and saving lives. It is time to enact this important legislation, and I yield back.
All time for debate has now expired. Each further amendment printed in Part C of House Report 117-10, not earlier considered as part of amendments in block pursuant to Section 6 of House Resolution 188, shall be considered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, may be withdrawn by the proponent at any time before the question is put thereon, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. It shall be in order at any time after debate for the chair of the Committee on the Judiciary or his designee to offer amendments in block, considering of further amendments printed in Part C of House Report 117-10, not earlier disposed of. Amendments in block shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for 20 minutes, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary or their respective designees, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The chair understands that amendments number 1 and 2 will not be offered. Is that correct?
Speaker, pursuant to House Resolution...
The gentleman will suspend.
That is correct.
All right. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to House Resolution 188, I offer amendments en bloc.
The clerk will designate the amendments.
En bloc amendments consisting of amendments numbered 3, 4, 5, 6, and 8, printed in Part C of House Report number 117-10, offered by Mr. Nadler of New York.
I yield myself 45 seconds.
Pursuant to House Resolution 188, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, each will control 10 minutes. The chair will now recognize the gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself 45 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this en bloc amendment includes several amendments that strengthen the bill and that thoughtfully modify it to account for practical considerations surrounding the use and misuse of firearms. Among this group are a provision that clarifies the exchange of firearms between family members, a measure to protect more expansive state firearm laws, an amendment that would ensure ATF background check forms are available in Spanish, and a proposal that would allow for temporary transfers for pest control. Representative Jackson Lee's amendment concerning suicide is particularly important as it highlights the tragic consequences that access to firearms can have on those who intend to harm themselves. I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of the en bloc amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Pfluger.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, and Mr. Speaker, thank you. I rise today as a Texan, a constitutional conservative, and in strong opposition not only to the amendments but to H.R. 8, a bill that would impose so-called universal background checks and gut the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding gun owners throughout this country. We all mourn the loss of innocent lives from gun violence that have happened in my district and in those around the country. No family should ever have to endure such tragic and terrible unnecessary loss. But the truth is that this legislation does nothing to address the root causes of gun violence and may do little to actually prevent criminals from obtaining guns, as has previously been said during this debate. What will be prevented, though? your ability to loan your neighbor a firearm if there are reports of break-ins, the ability of your suicidal friend or family member to ask you to remove your firearms from your home, or if a colleague comes to you and says that they're trapped in an abusive relationship and scared for their life, you could face $100,000 or prison time for lending out your gun for self-defense. If we are going to affect real change, we don't need to tack additional restrictions on law-abiding citizens. We need to look at the root causes and have a transparent and open debate here to talk about mental health and the proper enforcement of laws that we already have. This is yet another example of federal overreach, another example of the erosion of our rights, and a slippery slope that will strip all Americans of our Second Amendment rights as outlined in the Constitution. I urge my colleagues to vote no on the amendment and on the bill. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back.
Unanimous consent that Ms. Jackson Lee control the balance of the time on our side on this amendment.
Without objection. Without objection. So ordered. So what's next?
Mr. Speaker, at this time, I'll yield myself 1 minute.
Gentlelady is recognized.
For the Jackson Lee amendment. As indicated, the Jackson Lee amendment is a simple, important, and straightforward amendment, and it is frankly to save lives. To H.R. 8, specifically, the amendment makes clear that a gun owner who realizes that he or she is at risk of suicide may transfer the gun to someone else if the risk is imminent, without a background check to prevent self-harm. This amendment will help ensure that no person who is experiencing a suicidal crisis will feel compelled to retain their gun when it would be better for them to temporarily transfer it to someone else. Contrary to what my friends on the other side of the aisle have said, H.R. 8 does already exempt from the requirement of a background check a temporary transfer that is necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm, including to self, family, household members, or others, if the possession by the transferee lasts only as long as immediately necessary to prevent the imminent death or great bodily harm, including the harm of domestic violence, dating partner violence, assault, sexual assault, stalking, domestic abuse. This amendment, however, clarifies that this last option is available to someone who is at risk for suicide. I ask my colleagues to support the Jackson Lee amendment to protect those who may be in danger to themselves. I yield. I reserve.
Reserves. Gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry.
Gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman from Ohio. Just yesterday afternoon, 3 o'clock in Atlanta, an armed robber walked into Chick-fil-A. Going to rob the place. Now think about that. You're in there with your children, getting a meal in the middle of the day, and somebody comes in with a gun, puts your life at risk. Everybody in the place is at risk. Now, did that guy get a background check to get his firearm? We don't know yet, but odds are he didn't, because most of these crimes that are committed with a gun are with people that don't use. Guess what? I got a news flash. They don't follow the law. You know, robbing the Chick-fil-A at 3 o'clock in the afternoon in Atlanta is not in accordance with the law. But I'll tell you what happened. An armed citizen stopped the robbery using his firearm, legally obtained firearm, saved everybody in the place. You know who's happy? The people in the Chick-fil-A are happy that the guy that bought the gun legally was there to save them and their children. That's who's happy. This legislation, Mr. Speaker, disarms that person that operated his firearm legally. That's what this legislation does. It disarms America. It says to the criminal, keep on not abiding by the law. You got your weapon illegally. You're going to keep doing it because it doesn't stop them from doing anything. What it does do is it stops the guy who's going to get his firearm legally and end the crime in his community. That's who it stops. No charges are pending on that individual in Atlanta that stopped that crime. No charges are pending. He followed the law. This law, this bill, Mr. Speaker, seeks to punish people that want to follow the law. And that's what's going to happen. You know what's going to happen when we do this? There's going to be more crime. There's going to be more unauthorized weapons out there, and there's going to be less people out there defending themselves in our community. That's what's happening. I just urge a no vote on this. I yield back, Mr.
Gentleman yields back.
Good job.
The gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Speaker, I'm delighted to yield a minute to the distinguished gentleman from California, the chairman of our task force, Mr. Thompson.
Gentleman is
Thank you,
recognized.
gentlemen. Mr. Speaker, that's nonsense. What was just said on the floor is not accurate. The only thing this bill does is require a background check. If someone has legally purchased a firearm and passed a background check, nobody's going to take that gun away from them. They legally purchased it. They passed the background check. To come out with that kind of nonsense, that type of scare tactics, is not complimentary to the decorum of this House. And it does not speak to this bill. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Ohio.
I think part of the gentleman, thank you, Mr. Speaker, part of the gentleman's point from Pennsylvania was this system's a mess. Over 110,000 people were denied access to a firearm when they went through the background check, but only 12 were prosecuted. Mr. Massey led off our debate by talking about this. So that tells you one or two things. Well, I think the main takeaway is how many people were falsely denied, or if they weren't, why weren't more people prosecuted? If the focus is to make sure the bad guy doesn't get the gun, holy cow, over 110,000 were denied access to a firearm, not given the clearance, and yet only 12 prosecuted? That seems, if you guys want to work with us on that issue, we're happy to do that. In fact, that's what we've supported that and talked about that, but you don't want to do that. So, Mr. Speaker, I would reserve the balance of our time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlelady from Texas.
My pleasure to yield to distinguished gentlelady from Texas, a member of the Judiciary Committee, Ms. Garcia.
Gentlelady from Texas is
1 minute.
1 minute is.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of H.R. 8, the Bipartisan Background Checks Act. Mr. Speaker, I grew up on a farm. I was taught at an early age how to handle a .22 and a shotgun. We used it for hunting to put food on the table. But this bill is just simply a background check for every gun sale or transfer with common sense exceptions. As the previous speaker noted, this has nothing to do with keeping someone who legally obtained a gun from getting one. When my niece got her first buck over the holidays at the family farm, my brother-in-law gave her his favorite shotgun as a present. They were also excited. That would be exempted from any paperwork, and see, that just makes sense. My amendment also makes sense. It simply codifies the practice of ensuring that the background check forms and notifications used to purchase or transfer of a firearm remain available in Spanish as well as in English. Our country is blessed with a diverse population. Language diversity is part of that diversity that we should celebrate. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Ohio.
Mr. Speaker, we reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlelady from Texas.
Speaker, I'm delighted again to yield to the distinguished gentleman from Florida, Mr. Chris, 1 minute.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the chairman for yielding. I rise in support of the Bipartisan Background Checks Act. I also rise for my constituent, Mohammed Haytham. Mo was a young sailor who followed his mother's footsteps into the Navy with the dream of becoming a pilot. When a Saudi terrorist started shooting, Mo sacrificed himself to protect others. That's who he was. Service, selflessness, sacrifice. Mo represented the very best in all of us. The great state of Florida is proud of him and proud to call him one of our own. The naval attack at Naval Air Station Pensacola killed 3 young sailors and wounded 8 more. The terrorists brought the gun legally, using a hunting license to get it. Al-Qaeda and ISIS know about this loophole, and until we close it, the American people will remain vulnerable. That's why my bipartisan bill to close the Pensacola loophole has the support of the Brady campaign, the Giffords, major county sheriffs, and the Fraternal Order of Police. I look forward to working with the chairman and my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to pass this.
Gentleman's time has expired.
I yield back. Thank you, sir.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield a minute to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry.
Gentleman is
Thank the gentleman
recognized.
from Ohio. Yeah, we lament the death of our good friend, Mr. Chris's constituent, Mo. We lament it. We especially lament it because when you're in the military and you're on base and you're in uniform, you're prohibited from carrying a firearm. Think about that. Those in our country most well-trained to use a firearm lose their lives because they cannot defend themselves as a regulation by the DOD that says they cannot carry a firearm on base. That's why Mo's not here. Sure, there's a Saudi terrorist in town that's killing people, but Mo could have stopped that if Mo were allowed to use his skills provided by the taxpayers and desired by him. He wanted to serve his country. He wanted to serve his community, and he should have been allowed to. This bill is more of the same thing, disallowing American citizens to defend themselves, and unfortunately, Mo is a prime example. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Texas.
Pleased to yield now 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Lamb.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the gentlelady from Texas. I rise in support of my amendment to make perfectly clear that transfers of firearms between family members do not require a background check, are not subject to the strictures of this bill. We should make that clear in order to confirm what we've all said here today, that this is a bill that targets those who break the law, not those who abide by it. My amendment shows respect for the important tradition within many families in Western Pennsylvania and elsewhere of passing down a shotgun or a hunting rifle from a father to a son. That is allowed under our bill. And a further and more important sign of respect will come when we vote for final passage tomorrow to strengthen the right of those who obey the law by keeping those who break it away from your right to own a firearm. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio.
Mr. Speaker, we reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlelady from Texas.
Yeah. Gentleman from Ohio, we are prepared to close. Do you have any other speaker?
I thank the gentlelady. We were waiting for one, but if we need to close, we can say we're opposed to the en banc amendment for all the reasons we've cited now in the last hour and a half on this legislation, Mr. Speaker. With that, we would yield back the balance of our time.
All right. The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentlelady from Texas.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. As has been said over and over again on the floor of the House, H.R. 8 provides for the legal access of guns. It does not take away guns from any American. And in addition, the Second Amendment is truly preserved with H.R. 8, and it is in compliance with the law, which allows the regulation of guns even with the Second Amendment. And so we ask our colleagues to support H.R. 8 and the en bloc amendments included therein. I thank you and yield back our time.
Gentlelady yields back the balance of her time, all time for debate having expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 188, the previous question is ordered on the amendments en bloc offered by the gentleman from New York. The question now is on the amendments en bloc. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The en bloc amendments are agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. The chair now understands that amendment number 7 will not be offered. Is that correct? That is correct. The previous question is ordered on the bill as amended. The question on engrossment and third reading of the bill as amended. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Third reading.
A bill to require a background check for every firearm sale.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have a motion to recommit at the desk.
The clerk will report the motion.
Mr. Jordan of Ohio moves to recommit the bill H.R. 8 to the Committee on Judiciary.
Pursuant to Clause 2B of Rule 19, the previous question is ordered on the motion to recommit. The question on the motion. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. The noes have it. The noes have it. The motion is not agreed to. The gentleman from Ohio.
Mr. Speaker, I request the yeas and nays.
Pursuant to Section 3S of House Resolution 8, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question are postponed. Pursuant to Clause 1C of Rule 19, further consideration of H.R. 8 is likewise postponed. Under Clause 5D of Rule 20, the Chair announces to the House that in light of the resignation of the gentlewoman from Ohio, Ms. Fudge, the whole number of the House now is 431. The Chair now lays before the House the following enrolled bill.
H.R. 1319, an act to provide for reconciliation pursuant to Title II of Senate Concurrent Resolution 5.
For what purpose is the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to House Resolution 188, I call up H.R. 1446, the Enhanced Background Checks Act of 2021, and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report.
H.R. 1446, a bill to amend Chapter 44 of Title 18, the United States Code, to strengthen the background check procedures to be followed before a federal firearms licensee may transfer a firearm to a person who is not such a licensee.
Pursuant to House Resolution 188, the bill is considered read. The bill is debatable for 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, and the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, each will control 30 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and insert extraneous material on H.R. 1446.
Objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 3 minutes.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, H.R. 1446, the Enhanced Background Checks Act of 2021, is a critical bill to provide law enforcement the necessary time to keep firearms out of the hands of those who are not legally eligible to own them. The 2015 massacre at Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, which killed 9 innocent people, stands as a tragic reminder of how current background check laws sometimes fall short. Under current law, a licensed gun dealer conducting a background check on a prospective purchaser is permitted to sell the firearm to the purchaser if there has been no determination from the background check system, commonly called the NICS system, after 3 business days. This is the case even if the system has not indicated that the person has actually passed the background check. Often we refer to this as a default proceed transaction. While 96% of background checks are processed within 3 business days, an analysis of FBI data showed that over 35,000 guns were transferred to prohibited purchasers between 2008 and 2017 because of the default proceed rule. On average, over the course of the last decade, 10 prohibited individuals have been able to purchase guns at licensed firearms dealers through the default proceed every single day. The cases in which there is a delay are the very cases that ought to be carefully investigated. If NICS is unable to return an instant determination, and especially if there's no report after 3 days, there is cause for concern. There may be a good reason that these individuals should not own firearms, but the current system allows the transfer nonetheless. Under this legislation, as under current law, a sale may proceed immediately once a background check clears a purchaser, which is the case in the vast majority of instances. This bill provides, however, that for checks taking longer to complete, the FBI will have 10 business days for the initial background check investigation period. If the check is not completed during this time, an individual may submit a petition for expedited review. If a petition is submitted, unless Nix provides an answer within the next 10 business days, either clearing the transaction or stopping it, a gun dealer has the discretion to complete the sale and transfer the firearm. We must ensure that firearms transfers are lawful, and in some instances, that requires additional time. That's why H.R. 1446 is needed, to prevent the sale of firearms to prohibited individuals by providing the FBI with additional time to complete background checks. H.R. 1446 is a sensible and necessary approach to closing a dangerous loophole, and I commend our colleague, Congressman Jim Clyburn, the distinguished Democratic whip, for introducing this bill. I strongly support this legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Stauber.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand here today a retired law enforcement officer and the victim of 2 violent gun crimes. While off duty, a repeat offender shot me through my car window while I was with my wife, Jody. While on duty, another violent criminal pointed his gun at me and pulled the trigger. By the grace of God, his gun malfunctioned. Mr. Speaker, I was fighting for my life, and I am lucky to be here today to speak to this body. Criminals who are willing to take someone's life don't care about the gun legislation we debate in Congress. And the bills we are debating this week would not have prevented those 2 criminals from attempting to take my life. So let's talk about who is going to be impacted by these bills. The law-abiding citizen who are looking to protect themselves, their families, and their communities from death or great bodily harm. They will be the ones who are penalized for and prevented from exercising their Second Amendment rights. Defending my constituents' constitutional rights will be something I do until my very last day in office. And I implore my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to do the same. I urge a no vote. Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, I now yield 5 minutes to the sponsor of this legislation, the distinguished Majority Whip, Mr. Clyburn.
The gentleman from South Carolina, the Democratic Whip of the House of Representatives, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman, the chairman, for yielding me these 5 minutes. Mr. Speaker, I listened to my colleague on the other side. I still think about the night of June 17th, 2015, when about 9 o'clock in the evening I received a phone call informing me that something had happened at Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, a church that I know very well. The members I know or very well. Much to my dismay, I learned later in the evening that a Bible study that was taking place at that church had welcomed in a stranger. I grew up in the parsonage, and I grew up learning that what we find there in the book of Hebrews, the 11th chapter, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things unseen. These people were practicing their faith, a faith that taught them to welcome in a stranger. A stranger came to their door and they welcomed into their Bible study. They sat down. He sat with them for an hour. And in the further practice of their faith, as they concluded their Bible study, they rose to pray, and with bowed heads, only to open their eyes to the sound of gunfire. The stranger that they had welcomed in opened fire and killed 9 of them, one of whom was the pastor, a former intern of mine. Now, we later found out that the gentleman who perpetrated this crime was a white supremacist that studied the history of that church. And because it was the most historic African American church in South Carolina, he targeted that church and its worshipers. However, he should not have had the gun. And the reason he had the gun is because when he went to purchase it, when the 3 days expired as current law allows, they had not been able to verify the information he had given them, and therefore could not complete the background check. But under the law, they had to sell him the gun after the 3 days, only to find out several days later that some wrong information had been put into the record. Now I ask, and I sincerely believe that this gentleman's sophistication, he knew he was not to have the gun. Did he give the wrong information intentionally? I think so. And when they found the error, it was too late. 9 souls had perished. Now, the gentleman said that he was lucky that the gun didn't go off, and these laws would not have prevented that. This law would have prevented that gentleman from getting a gun. Now, I don't know why the other side continued to misrepresent what we're trying to do here. All we're saying is, if at the end of the 3 days, you ought to move to 10 days. And if the 10 days expire, you can ask for an expedited search. And if that expires, you still have 10 days. The maximum is 30 days. Nobody is keeping a gun away. Everybody should be able to wait 30 days.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman has yielded 30 additional seconds.
Ask the other side. Is a wait of 30 days worth the death of 9 unsuspecting souls? That alone ought to instruct them on legislation like this one. Are you back?
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The previous speaker indicated that you have to ask the government to exercise your constitutional right. That's the problem. What happened in Charleston was terrible, it was wrong, and wrong as wrong can be. But this bill is not going to stop. The FBI had 2 months. Didn't do it. Didn't stop this guy. They had 2 months. What this bill does is shift the burden. Takes it from 3 days to 10 days, and the burden now becomes on the American citizen to be able to exercise their constitutional right. That is not what the Second Amendment is supposed to be about. Unfortunately, it's where the Democrats want to take our country. With that, Mr. Speaker, I would yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Coughlin.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, if we lose the Second Amendment, then the First will fall. I want to remind my colleagues of a simple fact that is far too often swept under the rug by the left. Americans have a right to obtain a firearm for lawful purposes. I'll say it again louder for those on the left sleeping in the back. Americans have a right to obtain firearms. This is my right, and Mr. Speaker, this is your right. But let me be clear to everyone in this chamber. You will not take this right away from us. I know it's easy to be sucked into the DC bubble, but outside of here, in real America, when we say come and take it, we damn well mean it. This bill would unconstitutionally place the burden of proof for firearm purchases and transfers on American citizens instead of placing the burden firmly where it belongs, on the shoulders of the government. But let us be clear. The left is not here today to debate this bill, nor are they here to legislate in the best interest of the American people. They are here to shove it down our throats. My colleagues and I on the right have been called here to defend one of our most sacred rights. Because you, Mr. Speaker, think that the Constitution is just another piece of paper to tear down the middle of and toss aside. I speak for millions of Americans. I specifically speak for 700,000 plus Americans in my district when I say that if you think this bastardization of the Constitution will be met with silence, then you know nothing of the America I know. You want my guns. I know it. We all know it. Well, Mr. Speaker, you can come and take them. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished Speaker of the House, Ms. Pelosi.
The gentlelady from California, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding and for his great leadership of the Judiciary Committee. Thank you for bringing this important legislation to the floor, Mr. Nadler. And again, as an authority on the Constitution, you and I know that we do respect the right of the gentleman to have a gun. We just want to make sure that we are keeping people safe. It is the gun violence crisis in America, Mr. Speaker, is a challenge to the conscience of our country, one that demands that we act. We know what must be done. The solutions are clear. They have an overwhelming bipartisan support across the country, and these solutions will save lives. That is why I'm so pleased to rise on the floor to support Mr. Clyburn's legislation, H.R. 1446, the Enhanced Background Check Act, to ensure that universal background checks do save lives. He explained so clearly the purpose of his legislation. I associate myself with his remarks. I know how painful it is because he had friends in that church whom we have met, families of since then. And I also rise to support H.R. 8, the Bipartisan Background Checks Act of Mr. Mike Thompson. Mr. Thompson is a gun owner. He's a veteran. He respects the Second Amendment, and he is the chair of the Gun Violence Prevention Task Force. And I thank him for his decades of leadership on background checks and for the perspective he brings, again, as a gun owner and a veteran and a hunter. We all salute the extraordinary work with Mr. Clyburn, the leader of the Enhanced Background Checks Act, to close the Charleston loophole, and we respect him for the work he has done in his community to turn their agony into action, their pain into saving other people's lives. And I thank all the members who have helped raise a drumbeat on these priorities, including our colleague, Representative Lucy Macbeth, who has been such an inspiration to all of us, bring her great generosity of spirit in telling her story, sharing that story of Jordan with us. I thank Now, we also have a debt of gratitude to our former colleague, Gabby Giffords, who, when she was having a neighborhood meeting, there was an attempt on her life. Her courage is an inspiration to the country. Her leadership to end gun violence is something that is so remarkable. And under her leadership and that of the Bradys, we were able to meet with survivors over time to try to pass legislation to make the gun laws clearer and better, and really adjusting to the realities of technology. Another colleague, Bobby Rush, lost his son to gun violence as well. So again, we hear about the big events that take place, and they're horrible. But every day, people lose their lives. In fact, let me just see what the statistics are. Since 1994, with background checks were first created, and I had the privilege of being here at that time and actually serving as a whip for the legislation. Our leader on the bill was Leader Schumer. Well, right then, he was a member of Congress, Chuck Schumer, on this legislation. And since 1994, when background checks were first created, the system has stopped more than 3 million dangerous people from getting firearms. Every day when background checks are used, they stop an estimated 170 felons, 50 domestic abusers, and nearly 20 fugitives from buying a gun. Every day, Mr. Speaker. Yet over the years, people have exploited and circumvented the system. Today, someone with a violent criminal record or a history of abuse can go to a gun show or go online or even to a stranger in person to purchase a firearm. No background check, no questions asked, all perfectly legal. Well, they might be legal, but it's not perfect. And even when a background check has been initiated, it's not always completed. And that's what this legislation before us, Mr. Clyburn's bill, is about. The horrific case that enabled a hate crime at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, in which 9 innocent people were murdered while peacefully worshiping. As a result, up to 80% of firearms, because of gun shows, online sales, and the rest, 80% of firearms are sold or transferred without completed background checks. So it is in that spirit that I come to the floor. But when I come to the floor, I bring with it the thinking of the survivors who we meet with regularly. We have said to them, we're not stopping until the job is done. We respect our Constitution, but we also say that the Constitution talks about well-regulated. Again, these bills that we're talking about have long and bipartisan support by a vast majority of the American people. Over 90% of the public, including more than 90% of gun-owning households. Most of these folks who own guns have passed background checks. They support background checks, and they are supported by dozens of leading law enforcement, veterans, local government, public health, and other groups. For example, Mr. Speaker, the Major Cities is called Major Cities Chiefs Association, representing the nation's largest metropolitan law enforcement agencies, right? The lack of a background check for private sales and gun shows completely contradicts the purpose for which NICS was established, to keep guns out of the hands of those who do harm. For the benefit of those who don't know what NICS is an important program. Mr. Thompson has been a champion in the funding of NICS. NICS is the National Instant Criminal Background Check System. Next, the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys states, H.R. 8 will help the background check system catch up with changes in technology and ensure that individuals who are prohibited from purchasing or possessing a gun cannot easily buy guns online. And the U.S. Conference of Mayors writes that H.R. 8 will make our cities safer and in no way compromise gun owner rights. And that H.R. 8 is very important to us, and it is legislation that has broad support. It's called the Bipartisan Background Checks Act. That's Mr. Thompson's bill. And this bill, H.R. 1446, Mr. Clyburn's, the Enhanced Background Checks Act. So everything I say about one bill applies to the other in terms of its purpose, in terms of its urgency, and in terms of its honoring our promise to the survivors and the families who have lost their loved one to violent gun violence, to gun violence, that we are not going away until this legislation passes. and that we will meet the challenge, the conscience of the country when it comes to the gun violence crisis in our country. And I say that with gratitude to Mr. Chairman Mike Thompson and our distinguished whip, Mr. Clyburn, for their leadership, their determination, their persistence, and soon, hopefully, their success in turning their legislation into law, so that we can keep our promises to the survivors, and also that we can make the world safer for all children and all people in our country and throughout the world, as we are an example to the world. With that, I urge an aye vote on both of these bills and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back the balance of her time. The gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Kamek.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in opposition to H.R. 1446 and H.R. 8, aka the gun grabber bills. Madam Speaker Pelosi, you were elected in 1987, and I was born in 1988. During that time, you say that background checks have saved millions of lives. But what about the more than 50 million babies that have been murdered through abortion? So I'm just going to leave that there as we talk about the value of life. But these guns are not about gun safety, and they certainly aren't about reducing crime. These bills are about control. 2 weeks ago, Democrats voted to strip religious freedom. Last week, they voted to defund our police. Today, they are now taking our guns. In reality, these bills do nothing to improve background checks. As noted by an Obama official in 2013, quote, the effectiveness of universal gun background checks depends on requiring gun registration. Instead, it would increase our wait times and allow for endless delays for law-abiding citizens to purchase firearms. Our communities have seen too many tragedies perpetuated by sick people intent on committing violence, no matter the weapon. H.R. 1446 puts the onus on individuals to contact the government if their background check hasn't been complete in 10 days. You know who cannot afford to wait? The single mom looking to protect herself and her children from a violent ex who has just been released from jail. You think this situation isn't real? It happened last month in Orlando, and there are thousands more like them. You know that the more garbage that we find in these bills, the more I believe that the motto of these chambers is changing from we the people to let's screw the people. H.R. 8 and H.R. 1446 does nothing but make it more difficult for law-abiding citizens to protect themselves and their families. Under this legislation, criminals will do what they do best, break the law and perpetuate crime. So I ask my colleagues considering supporting these bills, do you honestly think that punishing law-abiding constituents in your districts, stripping them of their constitutional rights, will make them safer? Will you be able to look them in the eye and as they are the next victim of crime?
Gentlelady's time has expired.
As members of Congress, we swore an oath to defend the Constitution.
The gentlelady's time has
includes
expired.
The Second Amendment shall not be infringed.
The gentlelady
You and I both took that oath, Mr. Speaker, and with that, I yield back.
The gentlelady is not recognized any further. Members are reminded to address their comments to the chair and not to other members. The gentlelady from New York is recognized.
Good job. Good job. 2 minutes to the distinguished gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. McBath.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Chairman Nadler, and also the author of this legislation, H.R. 1446, Representative Clyburn. Mr. Speaker, domestic violence claims the lives of far too many, and it is especially deadly when it occurs in the household with a gun. Women, as we know, bear most of this violence. In the United States, there are 1 million women alive today who have reported being shot or shot at by an intimate partner, and there are many more who have been threatened or killed with a gun. And we haven't even yet discussed what the additional stressors of COVID-19 has done exponentially around the country in households when there is a gun in the household. Closing the Charleston loophole is a critical step to prevent abusers from obtaining a weapon. This is not about infringing upon anyone's Second Amendment rights. Law-abiding gun owners who are duly licensed and permitted, this is not about preventing them from being able to have a gun. But this is a critical step to prevent abusers from obtaining a weapon that will likely be used to escalate their abuse, and a weapon that may have deadly consequences. And as a survivor of gun violence, I know what I am talking about. With this bill and with this amendment, we can help prevent abuse, protect our families, and gather data to inform further steps to keep every American safe. That is our right. That is not a privilege. And in the next months, we'll continue to remember those that we have lost to gun violence in Charleston and all across America. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Hudson.
Mr. Hudson is recognized for 3 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, Newtown, Parkland, Las Vegas, Sutherland Springs, Charleston, the attack on our former colleague, Gabrielle Giffords. These are all tragedies that would not have been prevented by H.R. 8 or H.R. 1446. My colleagues across the aisle don't want to admit it, but every commercial gun sale in America already requires a background check. In Charleston, there was no loophole. The problem was information sharing. If the FBI had checked all available databases, then Dylan Roof wouldn't have been allowed to purchase a firearm. Congressman Tom Rice of South Carolina has a bill to fix that. Republicans are serious about ending gun violence and have brought forward policies that protect public safety without eroding our Second Amendment rights. That's why in recent years we've passed measures like the Stop School Violence Act, the Fix NICS Act, and 21st Century Cures. The bills before us this week would not build upon this progress, but strips away from law-abiding citizens their rights. H.R. 8 would turn law-abiding citizens into criminals if you store a gun for a friend or loan a firearm to a neighbor with an abusive ex who wanted to borrow it for self-protection. Even worse, H.R. 1446 would extend the waiting period for a firearm sale from 3 to 10 business days and allow the government to delay a transfer indefinitely. Indefinitely, as in forever, if a government bureaucrat says so. Instead of these gun-grabbing bills, House Republicans are bringing forward targeted solutions. That's why I introduced the Stop 2, Classrooms Over Conference Rooms Act, to double funding for the Stop School Violence Act, to harden schools, to get more mental health resources in schools, and increase active shooter training for law enforcement. And we pay for it by taking money set aside for the Department of Education to rent conference rooms in Washington, D.C. However, the left is determined to just take away your rights after voting to defund the police just last week. It's no wonder gun sales and concealed carry permits are at all-time highs. These law-abiding Americans deserve to have their rights protected. That's why today I'm calling on my colleagues across the aisle to stand up for law-abiding citizens and adopt H.R. 38, the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act. H.R. 38 is a bipartisan and common-sense bill that ensures people like Shaneen Allen, a single mother from South Philly, don't become criminals for carrying a legally owned firearm across an invisible state line. We need H.R. 38 more than ever. And if my colleagues are determined to pass gun legislation, then let's help people protect themselves. Mr. Speaker, if we adopt the motion to recommit today, we will instruct the Judiciary Committee to consider my amendment to H.R. 1446 to include my bill, H.R. 38, the Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act. I ask unanimous consent to insert the text of the amendment in the record immediately prior to the vote on the motion to recommit. And with that, I yield back the balance of my
Without objection,
time.
the gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline.
Gentleman from Rhode Island is recognized for 3 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, in 2015, a white supremacist with a criminal record was allowed to purchase a gun, which he used to kill 9 parishioners at Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. That shooter, who was prohibited under federal law from owning a gun, was able to purchase one because of a loophole that allows the sale of a gun to proceed if federal investigators do not complete a background check within 3 days. Through November of last year, there were more than 5,800 incidents where people who are legally prohibited, criminals, legally prohibited from purchasing a firearm, still obtained one because of this dangerous provision, which has come to be known as the Charleston loophole. H.R. 1446, the Enhanced Background Checks Act, closes the Charleston loophole. It strengthens background check procedures to ensure that federal investigators have enough time to complete background checks before a gun is transferred to the buyer. Common sense. But closing the Charleston loophole is not enough. Current federal law only requires a background check for the sale of guns from licensed gun dealers. Background checks work. Since the law was enacted, 3.5 million gun sales were denied, which means 3.5 million people who were prohibited under federal law because of a criminal record or some other disqualifying information were denied the right to buy a gun. They work. The problem is more than 20% of gun sales or gun transfers happen without a background check. And that's why H.R. 8, the Bipartisan Background Checks Act, requires background checks on all gun sales, including guns sold by unlicensed dealers online or at trade shows. Every day in this country, more than 100 people in the United States are killed with guns. Gun violence is an epidemic that threatens the public safety in communities all across America. We must not wait for another tragedy to strike. Requiring background checks on all gun sales is a common-sense gun violence prevention measure that serves as a first line of defense to keep guns out of the hands of dangerous people. I hope we can all agree that dangerous criminals should not be able to get a gun. And you know, there's been a lot of discussion today about the Second Amendment and gun rights, and we all respect that. But what about my constituents' right to live a life free from gun violence? To take a walk in a park, to go to a movie theater, to go to church and pray, and to be able to do so without the fear of being gunned down and killed. There is a competing interest here of public safety and protecting the security of people to live a life free from gun violence. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on H.R. 1446 and H.R. 8. Join us in supporting legislation supported by over 90% of the American people who have good common sense. Vote yes. Help end the scourge of gun violence in this country. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back, and I thank the gentleman from New York.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer.
A bill trampling on the Second Amendment rights of the American people is a convenient distraction from the actual crisis in the United States. There are almost 11,000 people killed by drunk drivers each year. There are more than 81,000 drug overdose deaths in the United States in the 12 months ending last May. But we're here today debating a bill to further restrict the rights of law-abiding citizens. Well, I just heard it mentioned about domestic violence. You could have a woman threatened by an ex-boyfriend or a husband who feels her life is being threatened, would not be able to acquire a firearm when she needed it. She would have to wait at least 10 days. The vast majority of illicit drugs, like heroin and fentanyl, leading to these 81,000 deaths, are crossing our southern border. Instead of addressing these issues, President Biden has reinstituted catch and release, and now we have an overwhelming surge of illegal crossings on our southern border. According to the Immigration Customs Enforcement Agency, in 2018 alone, there were 1,641 illegal aliens convicted of homicide. How many more will it be now that the Democrats have signaled that our borders are wide open? This bill reflects an obsession with gun restrictions by my Democrat colleagues. Meanwhile, in 2018, more than 1 in 6 homicides were committed without a firearm of any type. 1,500 were killed with knives or cutting instruments, more than 400 with blunt instruments, and more than 600 with hands and feet. Only 403 died as a result of a rifle of any kind. These numbers are dwarfed by the loss of life from the failure of the Democrats to enforce our laws. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Kelly.
Ms. Kelly from Illinois is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Experts estimate that the Charleston loophole has allowed more than 75,000 guns to fall into the hands of prohibited gun owners. The Enhanced Background Check Act is a necessary and straightforward fix to close this loophole and allow the FBI to investigate potentially dangerous individuals. This bill would simply increase the time federal investigators have to complete background checks and gun sales from 3 to 10 days. 1 week's time, that is all we are asking for. An additional week for the investigators to ensure that there is no reason the person who is buying a gun should not have one. Think of the lives that could be saved or could have been saved by allowing that extra 7 days. I think we can agree that gun ownership is a serious responsibility. There is no need to rush through a background check with so much at stake. This bill is an urgently needed tool in gun violence prevention. I urge my colleagues to once again pass H.R. 1446 and close the Charleston loophole. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Louisiana, Sheriff Higgins.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, thank you, and I thank my colleagues for engaging in this debate today. There's a higher authority than the law of man. Above the Speaker's podium are the words in this great chamber, "In God we trust." Do we? Do we recognize that the biblical record is replete with the violence of man? Shall we admit, shall my colleagues on the other side of the aisle admit that laws designed to restrict Second Amendment rights and freedoms are but a veil to conceal the violence of man born since Adam, the firstborn son of Adam, killed his brother in a violent rage? I'm rather certain he did not use a firearm. The Second Amendment protections that we have as American citizens shall not be infringed. Remember these words, and that they are born of a nation that recognized our service to our Lord. I yield, and I thank you, Mr.
The gentleman
Speaker.
yields back. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from New York, Mr. Espaillat.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Improving background checks is common sense. Background checks simply make it harder for guns to end up in the hands of the wrong people, criminals. 75,000 guns have ended up in the hands of the wrong people. The Enhanced Background Checks Act gives the FBI more time to complete background checks, and in doing so, it closes the loophole. The framers didn't think about carrying an AK-47 or a semi-automatic weapon. That's not what they thought about. These guns are dangerous, Mr. Speaker. They leave a pool of blood across corners in cities across the United States of America, and having access to them too soon is a deadly decision. So we must really pass this legislation to ensure that communities are safe all over America. And let me just end by saying we have a new item, the ghost gun loophole. Ghost guns are made to evade law enforcement. They're ghost guns. We should stop them now. They're on their tracks.
Gentleman's time has expired. He yields back. The gentleman from Ohio.
Mr. Speaker, the FBI tells us in a 4-year time period, 18,000 people denied their chance to, their opportunity to exercise their Second Amendment liberties to get a firearm. 18,000 people who were denied got that reversed. And those are just the ones who went there and said, you know what, you guys screwed up. It's not really me. They had to work it out. 18,000 times the system screwed up. In 2017, over 112,000 people were denied, but only 12 people were prosecuted, which means that thousands, most likely thousands of people, law-abiding people, were falsely denied their right to exercise their Second Amendment liberty. And now what do Democrats want to do? They want to say, oh, wait a minute. That all happened in a 3-day time period. We're going to extend that for 10 days because we know the government bureaucracy will get so much better in 10 days. We know it'll work out if we just give them more time to screw up more things. That's what's going to happen. And oh, by the way, that single lady who needs to protect herself, she's going to have to wait longer now for a system that had this many screw-ups to get the firearm she needs to exercise her Second Amendment liberties to protect herself and her family. That's what this legislation does. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Arkansas, the Dean of the, Alaska, the Dean of the House, Mr. Young.
That's darn near a shooting offense to call me from Arkansas.
I can fix that. The gentleman from Alaska, the Dean of the House of Representatives, is recognized for 1 minute.
God bless you, sir. I watched this debate, and I have to say we have an old saying, how do you eat an elephant? It's 2 bites at a time. We've had 2 bites today. This is not about what everybody's talking about. It's about the Second Amendment